Why is Benjamin Netanyahu lashing out at Egypt, Jordan and Qatar? He's been criticizing these countries since Israel began its war on Gaza. Facing growing pressures at home, what does Netanyahu want from his neighbors? And does he risk alienating regional players? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Since the start of Israel's war on Gaza in early October, its tenuous relations with countries in the region have come under increasing strain. It's accused Egypt of blocking aid deliveries to Gaza and criticised Qatar's role in mediating the release of Israeli captives. Neighbouring Jordan hasn't been spared either. Israel says it might not renew a long-standing water agreement because Amman has denounced its military offensive in Gaza. So is Benjamin Netanyahu criticising Cairo, Doha and Amman for political gain as he faces calls to step down? And how will his condemnation of these countries affect ongoing negotiations towards a ceasefire? There's plenty to discuss, but first, this report on Israel's fragile regional ties.
Israel's relations with Egypt, Qatar and Jordan were considered precarious long before October the 7th. But since it declared war on Hamas and launched a military offensive in Gaza, regional tensions have escalated daily. Israel accused Egypt of blocking aid deliveries into the Strip, something the president denies.
If I were the reason for not letting a loaf of bread into Gaza, how could I face God? No, I swear, Egypt's Rafah crossing is open 24/7 every day of the month. The procedures taking place on the Israeli side are the reason.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly said the Philadelphia Corridor, a narrow strip of land that serves as a buffer zone between Egypt and Gaza, must be under Israeli control.
The Philadelphia Corridor, or to put it more correctly, the southern point of Gaza, must be in our hands. It must be shut. It is clear that any other arrangement would not ensure the demilitarization that we seek.
Cairo has warned any attempt to occupy the border would threaten ties between the two countries. But it's not just Egypt that Israel's lashing out at. Reports in Israeli media suggest that in a leaked recording, Netanyahu criticised Qatar's role in mediating the release of Israeli captives held in Gaza, calling it problematic. Responding in a statement on social media, Qatar's foreign ministry notes that, if validated, the comments are irresponsible and destructive to the efforts to save innocent lives. Then, on Saturday, a seemingly unapologetic Netanyahu publicly pressured Doha to put pressure on Hamas.
Qatar hosts the leaders of Hamas. It also funds Hamas. It has leverage over Hamas, and Qatar said that it can help bring back our hostages. They position themselves as mediators, so please go right ahead and prove it. Let them be so good as to bring back our hostages.
Tensions between Israel and Jordan are also growing. A 1994 agreement that sees Amman purchasing 25 to 50 million cubic meters of water from Tel Aviv each year is unlikely to be extended. And a planned water and energy exchange, which was meant to have been ratified in October, is probably off the table too. Speaking to Al Jazeera in November, the foreign minister explained Jordan would not sign any deal while Israel continued to kill children in Gaza. Israel's ongoing disagreements with Qatar and Egypt, the two main mediators in the war, and its worsening relations with its neighbour Jordan will only further isolate the country, hampering any efforts to bring lasting peace to the region. Veronica Pedrosa, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, on Inside Story today, I'm joined by Dr. H.A. Hellyer in London. He's a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies. In Doha, we have Sultan Barakat. He's a Professor of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University and also the co-author of Back to Gaza, A New Approach to Reconstruction. And in Tel Aviv, we have Akiva Elder. He's a political analyst and a journalist. He also co-authored the book Lords of the Land, the war over Israel's settlements in the occupied territories. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story today, gentlemen. we are having this conversation at a moment in time where there is seemingly some potential movement around a 2-month pause in the fighting. This is obviously a really sensitive moment. So, Akiva, let me start with you. Why do you think, given the sensitivity of this moment in time, are we seeing such rhetoric and tone from Israel and Netanyahu in particular?
Well, Netanyahu is also one of those people who were taken hostages in October 7th. Just look at the reports about the statements made by his partner to the coalition, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and Mr. Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance. They made it very clear that an end of the war without being able to declare victory, and God knows what they mean by victory, is the end of the government. At the same time also, we have to keep in mind that his partners from the center, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, also are partners that are not going to be there forever. They also made it clear when they decided to join this emergency kind of unity government that they are there only for the war. So for Netanyahu, it's very clear. And actually, he said it. He said when he was asked about the day after the war, what is the exit strategy? He said the day at the end of the day after the war is a Palestinian state. So he is now presenting himself not as, he cannot do it anymore after October 7th, as the protector of the Jewish state, as the destroyer, if you like, of the Oslo Agreement, of a new Middle East, of peace between Israel and the Palestinian. And I am very sorry, but he is now the prime minister of Israel, is the problem of Israel.
I know there's been obviously a huge amount of criticism both abroad and at home of Netanyahu, but it would be in his interests to get the Israeli captives back, right? And obviously Qatar's been very involved in those negotiations. We've seen results in that regard. Dr. Hellyer, these comments that we've seen from Netanyahu on Qatar, they were leaked to Israeli media. That's often not an accident. So what do you make of that? What's the thinking here potentially?
Well, thank you for having me. I think it's very clear, and your previous guest alluded to this, Benjamin Netanyahu's primary concern is remaining in office, and he knows very well what plays with the far right within his country that buttresses his cabinet. He is indeed bound to have to deal and respect that kind of sentiment, and within that electorate and within the opinion base of those ministers that were mentioned, Qatar is a public enemy number one, irrespective of whether it is or isn't in reality. And I think that we have to expect that Netanyahu is going to continue saying certain statements like these. Sometimes they'll be public, sometimes they'll be leaked, but it all comes down to the same thing, which is all about showing himself as this figure that is going to stand up for Jewish interests above and beyond the national considerations of the country in a conflict like this. Of course, there will be many who will say these are identical. But if you look at the long-term interests of even from within the Israeli security establishment, he's not making terribly many friends.
Well, you say that these comments are for domestic consumption primarily. Sultan, let me bring you into this discussion, because if these are comments meant for a domestic audience, I'm wondering how they're going over abroad, and especially as these negotiations are taking place. Are they hindering things or affecting things at all?
Yes, of course. I think in addition to them being designed partly for domestic consumption, and particularly I think in justifying himself to the families of the hostages, they also represent a degree of frustration that Mr. Netanyahu must now feel, having gone so far into the war. He's killed almost 26,000 people, and he has still to achieve his declared objective. But also, it could be a way to play tactics within negotiations by placing pressure on the messengers and trying to place those interlocutors, these three key interlocutors, Jordan, Egypt, and Qatar, under increased pressure, accusing them of being more biased towards Hamas in the hope that they will help accelerate him achieving his objectives. And I think if it is the latter, then he's really misadvised, because it does reflect that he doesn't quite understand the nature of the relationship between Qatar and Hamas. He doesn't appreciate the effort that Qatar and Egypt have done, in particular, over the last few weeks, but for many, many years before that. In his long time as a prime minister, he's caused so many crises and conflicts, and it was always Qatar who's come to his rescue, in a sense, by providing the link between him and Hamas and the Palestinians. And by doing so, he will be undermining his own position. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans are now privately talking to him and saying, please hold back. You need to know who are your friends in this operation, who are the people who are trying to help you out here, and not just take out your frustration on everyone, blaming everybody but Netanyahu and blaming every other country but Israel for its actions in the Gaza Strip. So it's a very well-established pattern, I think, that he's falling into now.
Well, you talk there about ratcheting up the pressure. Obviously, Egypt has also been a key mediator in a lot of this, and we do expect them to be involved in the next round of talks. But we've also seen just recently at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, Israel was accusing Egypt of restricting aid. And there have obviously been issues around the Philadelphia corridor as well. I see that Israel is now saying they plan to deploy troops to Rafah and the Philadelphia corridor. I mean, Egypt has pushed back already quite strongly on that. Dr. Hellyer, how far do you think this could go? And I see you were also not agreeing with what Sultan was saying there.
No, far from it. So please don't interpret my expressions to disagree with Sultan. I think that my impressions here are, let's say, threefold. One, Benjamin Netanyahu is engaging in an incredibly cynical approach. Okay, so he knows exactly what he's doing. I have no doubt about that, and I think that there's a huge amount of evidence to suggest as such. So it's not really down to him being advised badly or any such thing. And I think Sultan would agree. It's a very cynical approach. He will make these statements. He will say these things even when he knows that they're not true. And this has been shown time and again, not simply over the last few weeks or the last few months, but frankly throughout his career. So that's one. Two, when it comes to the Americans are undoubtedly saying all sorts of things, not only to Netanyahu, but to other members of his administration, saying, this isn't a good idea, this isn't a good idea, this isn't a good idea. And they turn around and ignore it. And they turn around and ignore it because Washington refuses to penalize the Israelis for any of these actions. So, a good sort of, finger wagging in this regard means very little in comparison to what the far right members of Netanyahu's government are threatening to do. And more than that, DC backs the Israeli effort completely. There's huge leverage that Washington, D.C. has over the Israelis and has refused completely to use any of it in the past few months, and frankly, for much longer beyond that.
How is that going then in terms of Israel's relationship to Egypt? They've been pressing Cairo on a number of factors, and I'm wondering how that's going over with Washington as well, Dr. Hellyer.
So Washington, I'm sure, is extremely aware of what's going on in this regard. Washington views the peace agreement between the Israelis and the Egyptians to be incredibly important for the security architecture of the region, and knows very well that the links on security and so forth are indispensable. So when the Israelis go to the ICJ, and again, extremely cynically put across the idea that it's the Egyptians that are holding back aid, for example. Of course, this went down extremely badly in Egypt on multiple levels, not least of which because the Israelis control almost every single border with regards to Gaza, all air borders, of course, all sea borders, of course, and then 6 out of 7 of the land borders are completely controlled by the Israelis. The last border crossing, which is Rafah, is controlled by the Egyptians, but still with, let's say, Israeli veto. Which is why there's been such a trickle of aid going through Rafah, not because the Egyptians are stopping it, because the Israelis are stopping it. And this was made very clear by, scores of international organizations. There's no question about this. So, of course, Egypt responded very harshly. And there were reports that they threatened to pull their ambassador and so on. But none of this is going to go down well in D.C. The question is, will D.C. apply any leverage and use any leverage on the Israelis? And so far, nothing. As you pointed out earlier on, the situation in Gaza is incredibly dire. In response to the ICJ ruling earlier this week, following that, there was an accusation against certain members of UNRWA for having participated in the terrorist attacks of October 7th. And what happened as a result? Funding for UNRWA was suspended by a slew of countries, including the UK and the United States. Whereas much more of an accusation was made against Israel at the ICJ, the charge of genocide, and no such action was even remotely considered. Pulling funding from UNRWA at the time of such a dire humanitarian crisis is really unconscionable and frankly immoral.
Well, Akiva, let me throw this to you because I'm wondering how this is all going over in Tel Aviv. Obviously, there have been a lot of things that have taken place in the last few days that the narrative, the international narrative, has somewhat shifted. Has that changed the political calculus for Netanyahu here?
Absolutely. If you look at the polls that were published this weekend, you can see that if there were elections taking place today, Netanyahu would be ex-prime minister, the Likud would be ousted, and we may see a different government. So I want to make it clear, Netanyahu is not cynical. Netanyahu is a loose cannon, is somebody like Samson that is threatening to take the whole country with him down to the abyss. If I go, the country goes. He is acting like a royal, the whole family is like the royal family. And I want to remind you, Patrice, this didn't start in October 7th. On October 7th, there was supposed to be another huge rally against Netanyahu and something that we forgot already, the judicial reform. So I would like to make a distinction between Israel and Netanyahu and his gang. Even in his own cabinet, like the Minister of Defense, Mr. Gallant, who was ousted by him. And because of the demonstrations of the liberal Israelis, Netanyahu was forced to cancel his resignation, his ousting. So right now, Israel is paying the price of Netanyahu's legal problems. His trial is still on. He will have to testify maybe in a few weeks. Probably the court will give him some more time, and he will have to spend 3 days a week in a courtroom.
He clearly has a lot to face at home, Akiva, but I want to ask a little more about his relationship with some of these leaders. For instance, with Egyptian President Sisi, I'm just wondering whether some of these conversations that are going on behind closed doors are perhaps of a different tone than what we're hearing publicly. Although it seems that Sisi is now deciding to not take Netanyahu's calls at all. What's that relationship like now?
It's not only Sisi. I know that the King of Jordan was not willing to meet with him for a very long time, not only during this tenure. I know that the Saudis were very eager to establish diplomatic relations. But once he made it clear that we have to forget about putting an end to the occupation, talking about a Palestinian state, he made it even difficult for the Saudis to remind us that they were willing to talk to Netanyahu. More than that, Netanyahu is not welcome anymore in the White House. It took some time for President Biden to take his course. Now he lost the support of not only the administration, the Jewish community, the Democrats. And we have to remind all of us that somebody is very happy about this, and this is Iran. Nobody is talking about the Iranian support of terrorism, the Iranian nuclear program, and the Israeli public is aware of it.
There are a huge amount of regional dynamics at play here, but one of them is also the domestic political feeling in a lot of Arab states as this war on Gaza rages on. Sultan, we've spoken in the past a little bit about the feeling on the Arab street, the level of anger that's consistently risen over the course of this conflict. Is that changing the way that Arab leaders and regional leaders are now approaching Netanyahu?
I mean, as we have said again before, there's a huge difference between the leader's position and the people's position. No one can really say that Israel managed to keep the blockade against Gaza single-handedly. Egypt played an important role in maintaining that blockade around Gaza for years and years and years, except for the days when Morsi came to power. So that is one position that the leaders are doing. All the Arab leaders with a peace agreement and or normalization agreement with Israel have not revoked that, have not severed those relationships. Some of them withdrew their ambassadors, but by and large, they are all desperate to maintain the relationship, not just because it is Israel, because the understanding is that it is the shortest way to Washington, is to go through an agreement with Tel Aviv. So this has been ongoing for a long time. A country like Jordan, for example, shares the longest border with Israel, and it's in a very difficult economic position ever since the Iraq war, and then the Syria, then the COVID came really after that. And today they're having to deal with their northern border and the drugs smuggling that is generating from Syria, going all the way to Saudi through Jordan, arms smuggling. There are a lot of economic pressure on the Jordanians, and the United States is the main supporter for their economy. It provides them with the critical dollars that allow the economy to float. And of course, internally, it's like a pressure cook. It's building up. People cannot anymore accept what is going on in Gaza. As you know, 40% of the refugees outside the occupied territories live in Jordan. In addition, of course, unemployment is very high. It's almost reached now 22%. The debt is almost 110% of the GDP. But what I think scares Netanyahu about Jordan is the moral position that Jordanians are taking. And the fact that the king, his prime minister, his foreign minister, the queen even, they're all articulate, eloquent people who are seen as moderate voice around the world. And for them to come in criticism of Netanyahu, that is unacceptable. He wouldn't make any notice of, say, the Yemenis shouting against him, or maybe some criticism coming from Algeria, certainly nothing from Iran. But Jordan in the West is seen as a mindful state. It is a law-respecting state. And they have really strong relations with the West. And people listen to them carefully. But he is determined not to give them any space. The whole issue of 7th October started with the consistent attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the only part that is under the custodianship of the Jordanians. And he
we know,
Sultan,
that
exactly
a lot of
what he was doing.
Yeah, that a lot of that relationship with Jordan had deteriorated long before October 7th as well. Dr. Hellyer, just picking up on something that Sultan was saying there in terms of the relationship with Washington, how much do you think that the White House is actually dictating the ongoing relationship between these states and Israel?
So first, just one last word on Netanyahu, which is I want us to be very careful about apportioning responsibility or blame to simply Netanyahu for the state of how Israel is perpetuating this war. All of the senior leadership within the Israeli political system at present is pretty much on board. Okay, when we look at statements from people like Gallant, from the Israeli president himself, these statements were taken to the ICJ for incitement to genocide. It's not simply Netanyahu. I think the rot in that regard is much wider and much deeper. And we have to recognize that because there will be a day after Netanyahu, and people ought not to be naive about what that will look like. Now, with regards to DC and dictating, look, these states all have their own security considerations as they see them. Okay, whether or not I agree, or Sultan agrees, or Akiva agrees, or you agree, but they see them in particular ways, and they have particular calculations for doing it. And I think that they will continue to do so. I don't think that they're getting marching orders, for example, from Washington, how they must proceed or must not proceed. On the contrary, in many cases, they're putting down conditions that the Americans would prefer to do without, including for wider normalization. And it's been very interesting to see how even the Saudis that, I don't think they were as close as people thought prior to October 7th, but, that's moot. Any move towards normalization now from Riyadh is going to demand much more of a significant, substantial Palestinian component than would have been the case prior to October 7th. I think that's undeniable. The question will simply be this: will the Israelis move in order to satisfy any of these arrangements? Keeping in mind, there's been all of this uproar about, chants on street demonstrations about the chant from the river to the sea. Netanyahu made it very clear. He sees from the river to the sea Israeli sovereignty, and virtually nobody is now talking about even a two-state solution within the Israeli political establishment. The Arab states, for all of their problems, have talked about normalization for 20 years with the Arab Peace Initiative.
Netanyahu clearly has a lot at stake here. And as Akiva was saying, no clear off-ramp. We'll continue following this very closely here on Al Jazeera. But for now, we'll leave our discussion there. Thank you to all of our guests, Dr. H.A. Hellyer, Sultan Barakat, and Akiva Elder. And thank you too for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here, bye for now.